Hello, and welcome to a recording of Chapter 5 in the Colin and Martin book. And I'll just wait for there's our PowerPoint coming up. This chapter is essentially about the international community, and it's going to juxtaposition in the beginning the aspect of realism and liberal institutionalism. But let's look a little bit at interaction among different actors, right? We have sovereign states. We know that the word state means just sort of a synonym in international relations for countries. And then we have international organizations in this chapter, like the United Nations or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization or the European Union. And then we have non-state actors, right? Non-state actors, a lot of times we think about non-state actors as principled actors, but those principles can be for good or bad causes, as we will later come to find in the chapter, so that a non-state actor can equally be a Greenpeace or an Amnesty International, right, for human rights, or unfortunately a terrorist organization. And so, for example, a non-state actor could be the Roman Catholic Church and Pope Francisco right now. A non-state actor also could be a multinational corporation such as McDonald's or Walmart or Target or any of those. And so here's some other non-state actors, as I was mentioning to you, that maybe aren't the first non-state actor you would think of. The Islamic State, or otherwise known as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram. So they're not always the nice guys in the international system. What makes them non-state actors is they're not composed of government agencies or government actors or representing a sovereign state. Yet their role in the international system is so interesting. Look at the unfortunate events of ISIS and how this non-state actor has taken over parts of Iraq and Syria and changed U.S. foreign policy and some European countries' foreign policy in the Middle East. Look at the role of a Walmart or of Apple or of a multinational corporation like ExxonMobil and the power that those multinational corporations can wield in changing our economic system, even our personal income. And so in this chapter we look at, from the liberal institutionalist or liberal idealist perspective, the role of other actors outside the state and how interaction and collaboration can lead to outcomes in the international system. And so, of course, the mafia also can be a non-state actor. Now, juxtapositioning this or countering the thought of interaction, right, of collaboration, is the realist concept in the international systems of power poles, so that there are alliances of different power poles in the international system. And we looked a little bit at this in Chapter 2, right? And so many times you'll hear people say, oh, it's like the new Cold War, China versus the United States. Some people, the cover of The Economist magazine not too long ago, people were arguing it's the new Cold War, Russia and Putin versus the United States and President Obama. But here we have the Cold War and the power poles of the Cold War after World War II, okay? I'm sorry, not here, but in in this slide right here, we have the bipolar world of the U.S. alliance, right, basically under NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and versus the Soviet alliance or the Warsaw Pact. Many times when we think about a multipolar world as opposed to the Cold War bipolar world, we look at prior to World War I. And so here we have sort of a grouping of powers, right? And there you can see the grouping of powers in a multipolar world. And the argument there is that multipolar worlds are safer because they have a grouping of actors that play one off the other and allow for power among multiple actors, keeping the world safer. The argument for peace in a bipolar world is that one counters the other. Some people call the Cold War, that really ended around 1990-91 after World War II, as the long peace. Of course, those people who are involved in proxy wars would not call it very pacific. And then there's the unipolar world. Some people even today argue that the U.S. is a hegemon or unipole, right, meaning the only power. Other people argue that no, in today's world of technology and international networks, that's impossible. But a unipolar world is one in which one main power exists. Okay, so there are some questions, right? And here are some questions for you to think about. Are we in a multipolar system today? Is it the European Union, Japan, the US, China, Russia, maybe emerging market economies like Brazil, etc.? Are those the power poles? Or can we think about the world in a different way? Liberal institutionalists think about the world in more collaborative ways, and that states act for power, but also use their power for collaboration and cooperation through international organizations. So that power isn't this simplistic conception of one actor, one state, and all of its power countering another state. That there's a lot more nuance to the complexities of relations in the international system. Let's look at one of those complex interactions, and that's diplomacy. It's essentially the formal ways states communicate with one another. And here's an example of the U.S. Embassy in Rome. Many of you maybe have seen embassies, even seen other countries' embassies maybe, or consulates in New York or Atlanta or Washington, D.C. And generally, diplomacy is organized through, for example, our Secretary of State, who's currently John Kerry, previously was Hillary Rodham Clinton, or a foreign minister in another country, for example. Currently, and this date is February 2015, but currently John Kerry is discussing with the foreign minister of Iran agreements on nuclear weapons and nuclear weapon buildup in Iran, and whether the U.S. and Europe can work with the Iranian officials in that capacity. And so there's an example of cooperation, dialogue in the international system. There are different types of ambassadors. There are those who are appointed, and there are those who are State Department career professionals, and those that are career professionals are usually divided into the more business relationship, cultural attaché, hosting events on U.S. culture and exposing other peoples to U.S. culture, and then political attachés, those that work on treaties and state-to-state political policy relationships. And those are the examples of what diplomatic duties are for when we have ambassadors and consuls, right? Managing crises, communicating, remembering always that an ambassador is not his or her own representative, but rather the representative of the state, therefore following a very specific state foreign policy. We have some examples of good and bad diplomacy that are outlined in the textbook. One I will outline is President Obama's red line with chemical weapons in Syria that were continued to be used. And clearly we have not persuaded Israelis and Palestinians to stop conflict. But John Kerry, as I mentioned, is on the trail of a nuclear weapons accord with the Iranians, so there may be possibility for an example of good diplomacy. There's an example of excellent diplomacy, the Camp David Accords with President Carter, and there you can see Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin in 1978 issuing in one of the only Israeli Arabic state peace agreements in that region, something that heralded many awards for all of those actors involved, including an unfortunate assassination later of Anwar Sadat. But the 1978 Camp David agreements were examples of diplomatic shuttling, high-level negotiation, and a peaceful agreement. International law is another example of cooperation in the international system. And the father of international law, who wrote the Law of War and Peace in 1622, so we have a long established road of international law is Hugo Grotius. And generally, liberals tend to support law that promotes an international universal law, where more conservatives in the U.S. tend to highlight U.S. sovereignty. And there's a picture of Hugo Grotius. There are various sources of international law, and some of those we have read about, for example, the Convention on the Rights of the Child. International law encompasses not only diplomacy and war and peace, but also criminal actions. A good example more recently would be internet fraud and working among countries to stop that. Environmental law, such as the Kyoto Protocol and new negotiations between China and the United States for lowering emissions. Human rights law, including the Declaration of Human Rights, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the Protocol on Child Soldiers. There are two main international courts in the United Nations system, and that is the World Court, or the International Court of Justice, which is state-to-state cases, right, conflicts between states, and then the International Criminal Court, which began in 1998 and is really an interesting court because it is the only court that we have in the international system in which citizens can bring to trial leaders of their state that have committed crimes against humanity or genocide against peoples. The case of Ugandan war criminals would be a good example of an ICC case. That's really a tribute to the development of the international law in the area of human rights, the development through the Rome Treaty in 1998 of the International Criminal Court. And it sits in The Hague. And so I'm going to end with just a few minutes, and you can look at these links for why the UN is important, and we've read on the UN structure, but I will simply skip over the history of the UN to say our current UN ambassador for the US is Samantha Power, who has written a lot on ethnic conflict and has been a leader on the Security Council in the conflicts in Ukraine and in Syria. So the United Nations was founded after World War II, and it was essentially the aftermath of the failure of the League of Nations. The structure of the UN is not one that has a president. So you can see that the Secretary General is actually appointed by the Security Council. The main thrust of power in the UN, and you can read over these slides more carefully, but the main thrust of power in the UN are the 5 permanent members who are the Allied powers after World War II, the US, Russia, China, France, and the UK. And please note in Chapter 5 why Beijing People's Republic of China is now post-1971 on the UN Security Council. And then you note that there are 10 rotating members on the UN Security Council. It takes a vote of 9 total, so 5 permanent, 4 more, to pass any UN Security Council resolution. Of course, most recently, actions in Syria have been vetoed by the Russians and the Chinese, and so therefore there has been little action on the case of Syria. And here is a depiction of that power. There is also what we call the Parliament of Man, or the UN General Assembly, that passes conventions that eventually become international law. And one new one that they will be looking at in September 2015 are the new Sustainable Development Goals, which are the aftermath of the Millennium Development Goals that were passed in 2000. It's one country, one vote, and really a step forward. All countries are represented, minus Palestinians and Taiwanese for issues that are mentioned in the chapter in the UN General Assembly. And so that ends my brief discussion on the international system and ways in which there are collaborative efforts and efforts of power among non-state actors. Thank you so much.